right, good evening everybody, welcome back. Hello, hope you're all well. As you know, at the beginning of each term, or for the whole term, we have a theme, and we all remember what the theme was last term. But this term, it's Australian Modernists. So modernist period is probably from around 1900s up until the present time. And so we're going to be looking in this presentation at three women. All right, and you're probably familiar with some of them, so even if you don't know their names, you've probably seen their works. So this is Margaret Olley. Who's heard of Margaret Olley? Anybody? I've heard of her. Okay. So Margaret Olley, as you can see, lived for quite a long time, and her portrait was twice in the Archibald. So you've probably heard of the Archibald Prize. And that's Margaret at home. She's not a minimalist. She likes stuff.
It's a real artist studio.
She's got, well, it's not a studio, it's a home. It's where she lives. She's got a lot of stuff. But as I say, her portrait was twice in the Archibalds. She didn't paint the portraits, the portraits painted by somebody else. So you can see the difference in styles here. The one on the left by William Dobell, the one on the right by Ben Corty. Yeah. And you can see the difference in the styles and what that means with the time frame. One is a very contemporary painting, and the other one is, quite traditional. But we're not looking at portraits of her, we're looking at her work. She did a lot of different styles, but I'm mainly going to concentrate on what she's really known for, which is interiors and still life. And here are some of her still lifes. The thing you notice about her still life is the richness of colour. I mean, they're so beautiful because they're so rich with reds and blues and greens and all these objects. And if you remember that picture of her interior, you can see that she surrounded herself with all these things that she really loved. She really loved all her ceramics and the foods and flowers especially. And that's what she painted. She painted the things that she loved inside her house. I mean, she did other paintings as well, but I think this is probably what she's well known for. So we'll have a look at a few of her still lifes. Here's another one. You might notice that this colour palette she uses, it's not the same through all her paintings. The last one that we just saw have all these reds and greens, complementary colours, as you all know. And that vibrancy really helps with the reds and greens and complementaries together. And she painted a lot of interiors. So this is the inside of her house. She lived in Paddington, I think. And she must have spent a lot of time at home because there are a lot of interiors. Interiors are an interesting subject matter. Not that easy to do because you're painting a lot. You've got to paint 4 walls, or 3 probably, ceiling, floor, and all the objects in there. Can you imagine how much work it is to do all that?
In perspective.
In perspective, with the right light and the right colour.
And you look at some of the lights, like if you sometimes look at the walls, you'll see there's warm and cool colours. Like you look at that wall, you look in, you'll see the green against the red, but it's very subtle. And one thing that she had in her house was she had a lot of flowers, but she had a lot of plastic flowers.
Is that right?
Because they don't die. They're a lot of plastic flowers, and then she would put in live flowers. So that's something to think of because flowers die.
Yeah.
So there was a mix of plastic and real, and it's a little fun fact.
That's a good fact. Unlike Ian Uglow, who used to paint the dead flowers.
Yeah. Dead life.
So the other thing you might notice on the walls, the 2 posters on the walls. Anybody know whose paintings they might be of? I mean, they're not original, they're just posters. Begins with M. It's an impressionist. Well, yeah. Go for it. Yay! You should get a prize.
Okay.
Matisse, yeah, so she was very influenced by Impressionism. And some of you may have studied Impressionism at school.
Look at all those patterns too, the way they run around. See how the patterns go over and then they're running down. Like you have a look at how the contour lines, almost like doing contour lines with some of those patterns and tablecloths and things that she uses. So that's something to note too.
Yeah, beautiful. And there's the room. Okay, it's almost the same angle. The thing you might notice for like those fans of Where's Wally is actually the posters have been swapped around. But I think she probably had her painting set up in every room. So she could just move from room to room, continue her painting, and then when she maybe wanted to leave that one for a while, she would go to another room, do some more painting. This is interesting because it's the same room, but from 3 different angles that have been combined together to make this kind of panorama. Panorama? A lot of work in that.
It's like Cubist room kind of thing without, you know, different angles at the same time.
Sort of forced perspective.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Different colour palette again. So before we saw a colour palette with reds and greens, complementaries, and then there was the one with the lemons, a really beautiful lemon colour. Here, mainly greens, you know, with some of those browns to push back into the background. The thing that I think impressed me about her still life is that none of it's ever muddy. It's always really crisp, and the colours are really vibrant. Again, totally different colour palette. This one painted at night. You can tell by the window with the darkness outside. So painted under artificial light, which gives a different colour palette again. They don't look like artificial flowers though. There's another beautiful still life. You know, predominantly greens with yellows.
Look at that wall. Look how the reds and the greens are together. Isn't that beautiful? The way that light, instead of just one colour, it sort of really makes the colour, it's vibrant. They're complementary, but that's how you get that lovely feeling of light, and that's something that might be worth looking at.
Okay, so she did include some views of the harbour from around where she lived. But a lot of those included still life as well. So we've got a wider area of focus than we did last term. You know, it was pretty narrow, I think, what we were working on. And if we look at Margaret Ollie, these are some of the things that we can take from her artwork. Still life as the subject matter, her use of colour, interiors as a subject matter. I think interiors is a really interesting subject matter. Objects. She painted the objects she loved. So we don't have to necessarily paint bowls and flowers. They can be other objects, whatever objects that we feel that we're attracted to. And views, the views that she painted of the harbour and the city. And also her painting technique, which was influenced by Impressionism. So that use of colour, vibrant colour together. Our next artist, Margaret Preston. Anyone heard of Margaret Preston? Yep. A lot of these female artists were contemporaries, so they're all around the same time, but all with very different styles, very different focus to their work. This is fairly early Margaret Preston, I think, and almost abstracted, not quite, but almost, certainly simplified. And I think you're looking at this artwork.
We're going to do that today.
Oh, cool. Very cool. Yeah, so do you want to say anything about it? Or are you going to say anything about it? Oh, it's a secret.
No, look.
It'll be revealed. She was, in this work and some of the other works, I think, influenced by modernity. So the fact that there was a mechanisation creeping into daily life. Mechanisation in terms of what was happening even in the home. You know, mechanised things like mixers and, I don't know, toasters, things like that.
Look at those big shapes. The big shapes is what's emphasised. So it's really sort of big shapes, big colour, really simplified, as Peter says. And so that's what we're looking at. Looking at the design. So it's really the design's the big thing. It's not about the cups. It's about how they all fit together. And look at those simplified shapes, and yet they're quite big. There's not an awful lot of detail on the shapes, and yet they're very convincing. So it's about seeing simply. So that's actually a really good foundation for all painting. Actually, if you can see the way she does, you can use that as a foundation for even painting realistically if you like doing that. So this is a really good lesson.
It's an interesting painting because it looks simple, but it's actually quite complex, because there are things like reflections.
Yeah.
We've got reflections in the silverware. We've got these cast shadows that are really solid, but the cast shadows are not carried through to the objects.
Yeah.
It's weird, they're kind of just sitting underneath.
And yet you have a look at they look complex and all they are is shapes. You can really see how everything's just a shape. So it's a really nice way of looking at a painting.
Similar sort of thing, again, fairly sort of modernist, almost abstract pattern in this. And here are some of the almost mechanised things that are creeping into the kitchen, like the scales. Very reduced colour palette. You might notice that on these last two paintings. Almost monochromatic, hardly any colour. I mean, the only colour really in this is the apples.
They look greener. They look so green because of the monotone. They look greener than they probably are painted. We think that was painted in a bright green, but that's quite muted. But next to the others, it makes the green really stand out. So it really emphasises it. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they're the only thing that's alive in this painting.
Yeah.
Still life, like Margaret Olley, she painted lots of flowers. She lived most of her life quite close to here. She lived at Barara, so she had access to the bush. She used to go out to the bush. She was influenced by bush flowers. She was influenced by indigenous art, and you'll see some of that in her later works. But this is still very similar to the two paintings that we saw of her kitchen. Almost an abstract composition of pattern with very minimal colour. What have we got in here? We've got a red, we've got mainly monochromatic greys, and this ochre yellowy colour. But maybe one of the things that she's most well known for is her woodcuts. And you may have seen some of her woodcuts. They're often reproduced and put around the schools. As I said, she lived at Barara, which meant that she went out to the bush a lot. She saw the banksia there, she saw the wattles, she brought them back, she studied them, and she made woodcuts from those studies. She would also do woodcuts of views, harbour views, and she would hand colour these. So if you've done some printmaking, you know that you can print in more than one colour, and there's always a registration problem when that happens. But she would just print in black, and then she would watercolour the colour back in. Another harbour view. She lived for a time at Mossman, I think, somewhere around there. And one of the Harbour Bridge, of course. I think it's an interesting woodcut because it's, again, almost leaning towards abstraction, just geometric shapes that sort of slot together. I mean, we can see that there's a perspective in there. But if we took that perspective out on the road, it almost breaks down just into triangles and rectangles. This is a hand-coloured woodcut and another harbour view. So the areas of focus around Margaret Preston is, again, still life, bushland, some of the plants that she studied growing in the bush, harbour views or local views, printmaking, definitely, the design of her work. She had some influence from Asian art, and you can see that in her woodcuts they're very patterned, and the painting technique, certainly in the early ones with those monochromatic paintings. So as a contrast to these two women, I wanted to throw another one in that's a little bit different, who gets passed over a bit, doesn't get the recognition that I think she deserves, and that's Thea Proctor. She lived almost around exactly the same time as the other two. I don't know if they knew each other, but this is Thea Proctor. One is a portrait of her by George Lambert, that's on the left, and the other one's a self-portrait. She was a tutor at Julian Ashton's, so she taught, I think, painting and drawing there. But she did a lot of things, and I think because she kind of flitted around from one thing to another, that's why she's not taken quite as seriously. So, for instance, she painted fans, and strong influence of Asian art here because of the fan shape. But also, she kind of had a very different life, very much a social life where she liked going to the theatre, the ballet, going out to dinner, having a good time. She was a city gal.
Sounds pretty good.
She was a city gal. She wasn't hanging out in the bush. She was enjoying herself, all right? And you can see it in her work. You know, these are obviously the leisure class. Another one of her fan shapes. I think she was encouraged by George Lambert to do the fans. But she also did woodcuts, like Margaret Preston. But her woodcut subject matter was totally different. It really reflected what she was interested in. Leisure. You know, sitting around, reading a book, enjoying the sun.
Because today everyone could be on their iPhone.
Yeah. These are again hand-coloured. So a few of these. You can see it's very much city-based. In Sydney around that time, this is the 1930s, apartments were being built. So people were living in not quite high-rise, but higher rise than they were used to. And that's why they featured in a lot of her artwork. But she could draw. So that's why she was the drawing teacher at Julian Ashton's. She knew how to hold a pencil. But she also did fashion illustration. So she had commissions for magazines. She would do front pages for magazines. Illustrations for articles. Interesting to see the change in fashions with some of this. This is a very famous woodcut of hers. You may have seen this. It appears in a lot of places. And this is an example of how artwork can be recycled. This is our last couple of slides. So this was originally a woodcut, and I think then it was commissioned as an illustration for a magazine. So then it was turned into kind of a drawing, painting, illustration.
So something to note, like a lot of these, you know, there's a lot of faces. A lot of you like to actually draw portraits, draw faces. But actually look at the design, look at everything else that's going on around them. And they're actually doing things. And you look at the design. It's not just about the face. There's the flower. You look at the patterns and the ribbon and all these other things that are going on in the drawing. And also like the prints or any of the paintings, drawings, and prints. And just think about how you might be able to use those in yours as well. So it's not just about the subject, it's not just about this, it's about looking at a lot of the design elements and things too, because they're very, if it's very simple, it'll only work if the design's right. You know, you can get away with a lot if you're doing a complex drawing, you can get away with a bit. With something that's very realistic, but if something's more simplified, the other aspects really come to the fore and make the painting or drawing or print really sing. So that's the thing that we'll be focusing on too.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. A lot of the time when you choose to do a portrait, you tend to do the portraits straight on or maybe 3/4 angle. But you can see from this composition that, you know, this woman who's in the foreground is almost back view. I mean, you're not really seeing much of her face. It's just really a bit of a profile. And what's predominant is all these flowers that are around these women. It's beautiful composition. Beautiful.
So it's looking at that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They're very good. All three artists are really big on their composition. compositions and design.
So the area of focus around Thea Proctor would be social life, totally different to the other two. The style, she was really into style. Design, printmaking, that's a common. And the drawing and the use of materials. She used different materials. If you remember those fan shapes, that was painted maybe on silk, not just on paper. And fashion. She was really into fashion, right? And all of these are relevant and they're all useful. You can use any of these for your work. You don't have to think traditional art, think, oh, it has to be a portrait or it has to be a still life. You know, fashion is also a good subject matter. Style is a good subject matter. The things that you enjoy are good subject matters. So you've got to be interested in what you produce. You know, if you're not, if still life doesn't really do anything for you, then maybe find something else. Okay, so that's, they're our three artists, female artists, and we'll be looking back at some of their work through this term and using some of what they've done to springboard off into our own work. So we may not be copying their work, we might do, you know, depends, but it'll be an influence on what we do. And there's a big influence there. There's a wide range of subject matters, wide range of styles. Okay, so thank you everybody. So we'll get to work now. Thank you.